welcome to another episode of Questionnaire. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Sam Stone, and we will continue discussing the bilateral relationship with the US. But today, we also hope to expand a bit on the topic of foreign policy from the US. I think the most pressing topic that we have this week is Afghanistan. Could we get your take on it, Dr. Stone?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying, right, that the war in Afghanistan has been referred to as the endless war. It has been referred to as the eternal war, right? It has been literally going on for 20 years. It will have been going on for 20 years this year, right? In October is the 20th anniversary of that war. To put it in different terms, right, it has been around for almost 2/3 of my life, and it has defined my entire adult life and the entire adult lives of my generation, and really kind of redefine the history, right, of the United States, of American politics, of American foreign policy, right? I think it's easy to forget sometimes after the 20 years we've been through in this century, that at the turn of the century, it was a very different world, right? We imagined that maybe this was a post-conflict era, an era where the countries of the world would come together to work together, right? Not just Europe and other places, but also between the US and Russia and China. There's a lot of hope, right? And of course, 9/11 happens, and the US response to that is the invasion of Afghanistan, and then later the invasion of Iraq, which is a totally separate conflict, right, with separate motivations. And that changes everything. It changes the course of American politics. George W. Bush probably would not have gotten reelected without the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. A big part of his argument was, these wars are going well, you don't change leaders in the middle of the war, and so on, right? And even Barack Obama might have not had the prominence he had in 2008 without his opposition to the Iraq war early on. Yeah? So these two wars, but let's focus on Afghanistan, have really defined this century in the US especially, right? But across the world as well. So the Biden administration wants to finally do what the last three presidents have been talking about, but have never actually done, which is to remove the remainder of the American combat force from Afghanistan. And this was a decision that was made apparently by President Biden himself with his close civilian advisors over the objections of the top military brass, right, of the top generals, essentially. The generals have long had this position, and this is across party lines and so on, have long had the position that the US cannot simply withdraw from Afghanistan without certain conditions or certain things being met. That if we withdrew from one day to the next, that if we withdrew with no conditions, the Taliban would come back, right, would take over the country again, and it would allow al-Qaida and other groups again to operate, right, terrorist groups to operate from Afghanistan unimpeded. And I think there's some real concerns about that, right, and about what the U.S. engagement will be afterwards. But I think what President Biden has seen, and what really President Trump even had defined, right, at a couple of points, was essentially that the American people are tired of being there, right? We have been there, right? There are people fighting in Afghanistan now who were not yet born on September 11th, 2001. Yeah. So this has really become, as we've heard many people call it, a multi-generational war. It has become an extremely, right, it has always been, but it's been an extremely costly endeavor for the United States in terms of money, in terms of lives, right? And it is a war that most people are now very much ready to be over. So I think the calculation here for Biden is a couple of things. One, it's political, right? This is going to be politically popular within the United States, even if you have some Republicans and even some Democrats in Congress, right, complaining that this opens the door to, right, if not done correctly, opens the door to al-Qaida regaining strength and the Taliban taking over Afghanistan again, right? But it's a popular move. But the second consideration, I think, is a truly held belief of President Biden's. Back when he was vice president, right, his son, Beau Biden, who passed away a few years of cancer, his older son, he was serving, right? He was in the military and he was serving in Iraq. And Biden spoke out repeatedly during his time as vice president, we now know, to end, right, in favor of ending the U.S. military engagements, the U.S. wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So, this is part of who he is. He's very much connected to military families and to military sentiment. So I think this is good politics for him, but it's also just what he truly believes, right? That this is that it's time. And I think those folks like him, like, for example, former Republican Speaker of the House, John Boehner, right, who recently came out in favor of what President Biden is doing, people like them who were in Washington long before 9/11 and have remained in Washington or around Washington long after 9/11, I think they understand, right, the toll that this has taken, these wars have taken on the United States. And, 20 years is enough. It's by far the longest American military engagement anywhere. Right? So it's an important move. It's a huge move. It's historical, right? And most of the people that I know, including my friends who serve in the armed forces in the United States, are ready for this to be over. Of course, they'll all follow, and the armed forces will follow whatever the commander in chief says. Yeah. But my impression from polling and just in general is that pretty much everybody is ready for this conflict to come to an end.
Yeah, I think we even have Ted Cruz supporting Biden's decision, which is incredible. One thing that I hadn't thought that I would see, and we're still not in his first 100 days of presidency.
Yeah, but, well, foreign policy. I'll say this: foreign policy historically was a bipartisan affair, right? Yeah. You had people of both parties on both sides of the debate about any foreign policy issue. It's become much more partisan in the last couple of decades as everything has become more partisan. But historically, right, you had people from both parties, right? People
I think who were, Republicans after the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war became known kind of like as the war hawks. And that's when we started to see a more shift, like partisan inspired foreign policy rather than a bipartisan effort. But like you said, at the end of the day, that is mostly the thing that they can agree on, even if domestic policies continue to be the thing that they cannot agree on.
Yeah.
But like you said, I think it will be interesting. Especially given the fact that he's removing all troops. Not all troops that are currently in Afghanistan are only from the US. There's also the whole NATO thing. There are some British veterans that have protested against withdrawing from there. And then the Taliban that had gone to agree to like work with the US and everything now have said that they have won the war. And I was reading up for this and I didn't know that they had created this kind of shadow government. So when the Taliban were removed from power at the beginning of the war, afterwards they did the deal with the US. And right now they have this thing called shadow government, where basically for every position of government, the thing that they do is have another person that oversees that. So I think it will be crazy to see how that will continue to work, because they still call themselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghan. So I don't know how they will be able to deal with all of that without having troops on ground, and what that will mean for their humanitarian efforts and their diplomatic efforts.
Yeah, so there's two different issues there, right? One is, how does this work with the US's allies, both within NATO and without, right? There are contingents of soldiers from countries that are not part of NATO, like Georgia, right? The Republic of Georgia, not the US state of Georgia, that right, are participating in the NATO mission, even though they're not NATO. So the US has made a big effort to make this decision with NATO, right? Biden consulted with NATO leaders. He consulted with the Secretary General of NATO, and right, the announcement was made, at least part of the announcement was made by Secretary Blinken alongside the NATO Secretary General, right? And so there's been a lot of effort to work with the allies and to work with NATO, which of course we know was not the case with President Trump. So it seems like, from what I can gather, is that European leaders in particular are happy with how the decision-making process occurred. But as you said, right, not everybody in NATO, either in NATO as an organization or in NATO allied countries, agree with the decision, right? There are perspectives, and there are valid perspectives that, as you said, this withdrawal can complicate any sort of future stability for Afghanistan, especially as the Taliban is undoubtedly preparing to try to regain control of the country. So that brings us to the second point, right? Which is what happens next, and how do you handle the Taliban, considering the fact that you will no longer have combat troops? My guess, and this is not totally clear yet, my guess is that there are probably going to be a handful of troops, maybe a couple hundred, that remain, American troops who remain in Afghanistan entirely in the role of advisors and trainers. I don't think that they're going to engage in combat anymore, right? That's the whole point. but I think they will stay and help train. I don't think you would remove them completely, right? Try to prepare the Afghan forces to continue the struggle with the Taliban. There had been, right, this agreement between the US and the Afghan government and the Taliban. Uh, Part of the military argument for remaining in Afghanistan was that this military presence was kind of a way to encourage the Taliban to stay on this path, right? As you said, they've now declared they've won the 20-year Afghan war and so on. Is it going to be complicated? Yes. But the reality has been for the last decade or so that it's become clear that the options that the military seems to provide, or that at least, the brass, the generals seem to provide American presidents, whether it was Obama or Trump or now Biden, was basically stay forever or leave and the Taliban will take over, right? And I think what President Biden here is trying to figure out is sort of a middle ground, right? Where you don't stay, not in a combat role, not in very large numbers, but you try to do other things to try to continue to combat the Taliban and or bring them to the negotiating table. One is going to be an increased diplomatic push, and I think there's some chance of that having some effect. And the second is going to be working not through large numbers of ground troops and so on, but rather through small teams of special operations forces and so on, that I think are going to continue having some sort of presence, probably, in Afghanistan, officially or unofficially, after the withdrawal. But it's going to be a much, 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 much smaller footprint than we have now, right? And this is consistent with Biden's position on the Afghanistan and Iraq wars over the last 15 years. And it's consistent with where I think the majority of the American people are and with the majority of the Democratic Party is, for sure.
Yeah, I think we have this thing called in Mexico that we always say there's always a tweet to refer to, like when our president says something that he criticized someone for doing it. But in this case, there's a tweet, like there's always a tweet for Biden on withdrawal. He was tweeting, I think, back in 2014 when he was vice president about getting out of Afghanistan. And I think what you said is like, it's going to be the ultimate question. What's going to happen? Are the Taliban just going to continue normally, or is it going to turn into a bloodbath? And if there's a possibility, because the Kabul government does believe that it's going to turn into a bloodbath once the US is out, do you think that he would consider sending troops back in, or do you think that he would focus more of his attacks kind of like more Obama era focus with like drone strikes and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, right. I think that's where it's going. I think it's going to be limited drone strikes, limited incursions by special forces teams like the SEAL Team 6 that tried to capture and then eventually killed Osama bin Laden. It's going to look much more like that. And there are plenty of reasons why we could criticize those sorts of strikes. Right, there are reasons under international law why they might be in some cases illegal. There are human rights concerns and concerns under the laws of war, right? The laws of armed conflict, what we call international humanitarian law. But it's a much more politically palpable opinion, sort of path, I think, for an American president right now, whether it was Biden or somebody else. It just makes more sense for the United States right now to conduct whatever missions they're going to continue to conduct in Afghanistan that way, right? Small footprint, not a permanent mission, maybe 100 people, maybe 200 who are going to be protecting the embassy in Kabul, who are going to be training the Afghan forces. But yeah, it's likely that this will turn into a new conflict, right, between the Afghan forces and the forces of the Taliban, and it'll be interesting, right, to see whether the Taliban really has the type of strength that maybe it seems to have, or whether it doesn't. And that's going to, I think, come through in the next few weeks and months as we see how things develop through the withdrawal. The other thing to mention, right, about the allies, which I kind of forgot, right, which is that it's not as easy for all countries to remove their troops from a battlefield, right, from a theater of conflict. The U.S. has pretty good logistical capabilities to move people and material in and out of anywhere fairly quickly. But that's not true for everybody, right? You've got countries like the UK, like Germany, that probably can, but like, for example, Georgia, right? Again, the small Republic of Georgia has a couple million people. It has almost 900 troops serving alongside Americans and other Europeans in Afghanistan. Will they be able in a few months to withdraw those troops and withdraw their material and so on? Maybe, maybe not, right? So I think as we get closer, we might see the U.S. Intervene more and trying to help these countries carry out their withdrawal, maybe directly, maybe financially. But we're going to see some tension there. At the end of the day, I don't think it's going to be a huge deal, but it is something that right now I can almost assuredly say there are some generals in some countries who are going, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this right between now and September 11th?
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, because they were even meant to do this by May 1st, because that was the agreement that the Trump administration reached with the Taliban, that they would leave in May 1st. So I think that it's a bit interesting that Biden has gone. I obviously believe that it's because of the pandemic and the state of the country, that he just went, I'm not doing it by May 1st. I'm going to choose a symbolic date, because it is a symbolic date. It will be the 20th anniversary of 9/11 that did inspire this war. And I think it's also going to be a symbolic message, kind of like terrorists and on counter-terrorism things, because terrorists might not care about 9/11. What I mean is basically that one of the reasons that Afghanistan was such an important thing for the US is that it was a terrorist hotspot. Right. So to get out from there and continue supporting like the stability of Afghanistan will be just, yes, because they care about Afghans and Afghanistan's stability, but it's also because they want to avoid it turning into another terrorism hotspot.
Right. Exactly. And that's sort of been the challenge, right? I mean, the challenge for the US in many places, in Yemen, in Somalia, and so on. So yeah, I think the delay is probably in part to be able to have that symbolic date. In part, it's probably the pandemic, as you say. In part, it's probably a concession to the generals, right? At some point, Biden probably said, okay, you know what? We're leaving, right? I hear you. I consulted you. And this was apparently, I mean, everybody seems very intent on emphasizing that this was a very consultative, deliberative process. This wasn't just Biden deciding, right? But basically, I think at some point he kind of said, okay, you know what? I've decided we're withdrawing. Let's come up with a plan to withdraw. Can we do this by May 1st? And I assume that all of the generals were like, no, right? And this is also kind of his concession to them, right? Okay, fine. We're not going to do it by May 1st. Let's try to, find a date that's soon, but that provides enough time, right? And again, probably also important for the US's allies, both NATO and otherwise, who are there, who don't have the same logistical capabilities that the US has to move troops and material in and out of places. But yeah, this is going to be a big deal. The US has managed, right, to some degree, to stop Somalia and Yemen from becoming such havens for terrorist groups that they're able to then attack the United States or attack Western allies. Of course, there have been terrorist attacks against American and European targets in the last 20 years. I happened to be in Europe when the attack, for example, on the Madrid train system, right, back in 2004 and so on. So, I mean, there have been attacks, but my impression is that the conclusion is that there are other ways to handle countries like Yemen, like Somalia, like Afghanistan, that threaten to become once more a haven for terrorist groups, but that you can try to manage that in other ways that don't require a permanent, large-scale military presence on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because, as you say, that military presence can backfire on them. Some history lessons here: the Taliban were actually trained during the Gulf Wars, right?
Yeah. And even before that, during the Afghan and during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, right, in 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and the Soviets, to support a communist-led government in Afghanistan, right, it was kind of expanding Russia's, right, the Soviet Union's sort of sphere of influence in that region, and it turns into a 10-year disastrous war. It's basically the Soviet Union's Vietnam, right, where basically they're fighting in this inhospitable terrain. They're fighting paramilitary type groups that are funded by the other side, right? In the case of the US and Vietnam, they were fighting the Viet Cong, who were funded by the Chinese and the Soviets, and the Soviets in Afghanistan were fighting the Taliban, right, who were funded by the United States. So yeah, that's exactly right, right? The US funded, supported, trained at least the initial stages of the Taliban. I mean, we used to say, right, that you could probably find the receipts somewhere, right, from the material and so on that was given to this group. So yeah, it's a complicated history there, right? But basically, what happened was in the 1980s, the Taliban and affiliated individuals, including Bin Laden, saw the Soviet Union as the greater enemy. Right? They basically say, well, they're godless, right? They don't want any religion and so on and so forth. And so we'd rather get the US's support to fight them, and they're actually invading us. So we'd rather get the US's support to fight them than try to fight everybody at once. So yeah, definitely the US, right? We have a history of involving ourselves in conflicts all over the world and not necessarily thinking clearly about what the long-term consequences of those involvements are. It's kind of a side note, but an important one, just to give another example of this, right, is Central America. A lot of these maras, right, a lot of the organized gangs, organized crime, including MS-13 and Maras Salvatrucha, right, these very now today strong organized crime groups are made up, or at least were started by people who were trained by the US in the 1980s as paramilitaries to fight the so-called left-wing governments in Central America. And when the US decides, right, the Cold War ends, the US leaves Central America. It's cheaper for the US to leave guns and bullets and other material in Central America than to withdraw it. So the US leaves it there, and it leaves all these guys, right, with a bunch of training in basically war and very little else to do, and no prospects for jobs and no prospects for advancement, no real opportunity to participate in public life. And so they do what they know how to do, right, which is violence, and then make a living off of violence. And so it's just two examples in recent history of how we have gone into different places as the United States, and we've done things that are not that great, and we have not really thought out, right, the long-term 10, 20, 30, 40-year consequences of those actions. And I know I'm encouraged more to see that, at least in the Democratic Party, there's more of a willingness to acknowledge these mistakes and say, hey, we're going to try to learn from them and fix them. Not so much in the Republican Party, but it's a step in the right direction to, in the future, trying to not do those things, right? Even if you're acting only in the interest of the United States, even if you don't care about sort of the ethical and moral consequences beyond, right, the interest of the United States, obviously the long-term consequences of these individuals in Central America becoming part of these maras, not in the interest of the United States, right? The long-term consequences of supporting, the initial sort of people who were starting to form al-Qaida and the Taliban in the late 1970s and 1980s, not good for the United States, right? In the long term. And so these were opinions that during the Bush years were very controversial. I got called. I had one person once say I was a traitor to the country because I was against the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars and stuff like that. But I think most people have come around to the view that we need to take these things seriously and really think about what the long-term implications are of our political, but also our military involvement abroad.
Yeah, exactly. I believe that US interventionism has become a really hot topic, especially as we study it more, as we study the effects and the consequences of US interventionism. And
Yeah.
actually, a side note brings us to the next topic, which is Kamala Harris' visit to Central America and to Mexico to discuss the topic of migration. What's your take on this?
Yeah.
That it's going to be VP visiting before the president.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things. I mean, one is that, right, Kamala is younger, and I'm sure there's some concerns about the pandemic. And I think there's also some concern about the optics of Biden leaving the country while the pandemic is still being gotten under control, right? I mean, everybody knows in Washington, or at least everybody thinks in Washington, that the 2022 midterms and the 2024 presidential election are going to be decided based on, do the Democrats fix the pandemic or not? And if the pandemic is not fixed by Biden, basically they will lose, Democrats will lose. And if it looks like, or it feels like, they've done a good job controlling the health aspects and the economic aspects, they'll win. So I think the idea is for Biden to look like he's focused on the pandemic, right? And then a little bit here on climate change, like with the climate summit that's coming up in the next few days and stuff like that. So I think it makes sense, right, for Kamala to take points. She's also supposed to be in charge of the situation along the border. So I think it makes sense. I don't think it's supposed to be, I don't think it's a snub or it's any sort of like, we don't care about you enough. I think it's just, this is a very important person in the administration. It's a very important person, right? Literally the second most important person. It's the person who's been put in charge of this area of policy. And so I think it makes sense for her to be the one who comes down and has these first meetings in person. The in-person meetings are important. They're symbolic. But at the end of the day, I think as we've all learned now with the pandemic, you can conduct a lot of this electronically. And so hopefully, right, hopefully, the meetings are positive. But a big part of this is basically trying to show that something is being done about the situation of the border. And if you can get some concrete results out of it, then, all the better.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's, like you said, it's symbolic. It's her visiting, it's her going to the places, because they've been talking a lot about migration and fixing the root causes of migration, which one is, like you said, the instability left behind by the US's intervention and the current political and economic climate in the region. So I think it's, like you said, it's symbolic. I know that López Obrador said that he wanted to take her to Campeche and Chiapas, which are the southern borders with Guatemala, so he can see what migration is there. I know also that López Obrador is placing this really important emphasis on protecting kids and minors. I remember seeing recently, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, a video of a coyote or a pollero, who are the people that help smuggle people across the northern border of Mexico with the southern border of the US illegally. And he just threw these little girls, I think they were like 3 and 2 years old, from like 3 meters of height, and they just fell, which is extremely dangerous. But I think it will also give Kamala the opportunity to kind of hear these stories, because I don't think that the militarization of the border is going to be the solution permanently. It's a solution right now because they don't want to accept people. I also know that Biden put this cap on refugee intake back to Trump levels, which goes against his campaign promises. But I think that we'll continue to push for that policy right now. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I'm still hopeful, very hopeful that over the next few years, we're going to see what Biden campaigned on with immigration come to pass, right? Especially with refugee policy. Right now, I think they're just so massively overwhelmed, and they're simply trying to send the message, hey, don't come, don't try to get here. We can't take you right now. And I think setting those levels at Trump levels might be, setting the refugee level at Trump levels is basically, I think, what they're trying to, it's one of the ways they're trying to achieve that. I think it's incredibly important that Kamala is going to go, right? The Vice President Harris is going to go to the southern border of Mexico, right? That is going to go to the Guatemala-Mexico border. I'm not sure when the last time an American president or vice president was actually in Central America, right? Not Mexico, but in Central America. I'm not sure if any American president or vice president has ever been to Mexico's border with Guatemala, right? I don't think so. I would have to check. But these seem to be, if nothing else, it's symbolic, and it shows, I think they're going to try to show that the Biden administration cares about the human side of this, right? That it's not just an economic question, that it's not just a question of, the numbers at the border, that really this is a human thing. And whatever else we might think about Joe Biden, he really does care about people. I mean, we've seen this in his career, in his life, over and over and over again. It's not a show, right? I mean, these stories that you hear, I know some people who, have worked closely with him, not recently, but in the past, right? And he really does go out of his way to connect with people, to try to help people, to empathize with people, with human beings at a personal level, even when the cameras aren't on him. And so that's, I think, part of what this is going to be. It's let's try to find a way to connect, right? And I think that it's also a chance for Vice President Harris and President López Obrador to maybe spend a little more time together, right? I think going to the southern border of Mexico makes sense. And, not all diplomacy is about the interpersonal relationship between the leaders. On the contrary, I think the Mexico-U.S. relationship is primarily institutional, but President López Obrador seems to value those personal relationships. And if Vice President Harris can try to build that relationship with him, that could be a very positive thing for the relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, I think if Lopez Obrador continues to claim that he had a really good relationship with Donald Trump, then he should have no problem having a good relationship with Kamala Harris and with President Biden. Although he did recently say that he hadn't congratulated President Biden at the beginning when the election was still being called a fraud by Donald Trump, because he had suffered from fraud in an election before and he didn't want it to be the same, which I think is a controversial stance to take. But I don't think Biden is really going to give it the end of the day. At the end of the day, like you said, it's really an institutional relationship. They cannot get along, but they will still have to get along at some point, up to
Right.
some extent, to fix the issues and the bilateral issues. And I
Yeah,
think just to close
I mean, yeah, for sure. Like
So go
I
ahead.
definitely don't think that President Biden is going to be like personally offended or anything like that by the statements. It doesn't seem to me like the best thing to say, right? If I was President Lopez Obrador, I think his stance, his original stance, which was, I'm going to wait till the Electoral College votes because that's when the president is officially elected, right, in the U.S. system. That's fair, right? I think that wasn't a crazy sort of assessment to make. I know he got criticized for that a lot, and there may be reasons we could criticize that, but it's not out of left field. But saying, oh, well, the reason I really didn't congratulate him was because maybe there was fraud, that's a little more complicated. You could argue that, well, what he's really referring to is that, maybe, right, he wanted to wait for the courts to decide Trump's challenges and stuff like that. Again, there are ways that you can sort of rationalize it. Is it the most productive thing to say in the bilateral relationship? No, probably not, right?
Not.
If I was advising him, I would advise against saying something like that. Will it have a serious impact? Probably not, right? I think both sides right now have real policy issues that they want to achieve for policy reasons, for political reasons, right? If President Lopez Obrador can get a lot more doses of the vaccines. Again, I know we keep talking about the vaccines on the show, but that is kind of the definitive issue, right? If he can get more doses and distribute more doses within Mexico before the elections this summer, that's going to be a huge boost to his party's chances of retaining control of Congress, right? And if not, that could hurt, right? Like with any other country right now, the central issue in elections is basically how well did you deal with the pandemic, and I think that's very important for him and for the U.S. Right? Biden's pandemic response has been a roaring success, and the one thing that seems to be distracting from the narrative of Biden is doing great is the situation at the southern border. So the U.S. wants to try to control that, right, in order to for policy reasons. I'm not saying this is all political, right? There are real policy reasons behind this. But it's also politically beneficial for the Biden administration to be able to control the one sort of, we could say, weak spot or weaker spot in what is otherwise a very positive narrative for President Biden's first 100 days.
Yeah, exactly. I think just to close on this topic before we discuss Putin and Biden and then close the program, I wanted to hear your take on this letter written to President Biden and VP Kamala Harris by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, basically after the Ted Cruz expedition to the Rio Grande border, and then after Kamala's announcement that she would be visiting Central America. What's your take on this? What's your take on the allegations that he makes of criminal organizations here in Mexico, what we call narcotraficantes, and in the US it's drug traffickers, and then being named as terrorists, because I know that they cannot be named as terrorists because there's no political motivation based on international law. But do you think there's any chance they would do that just in the US in order to fight them more effectively?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. One is that Republicans are scrambling to find anything that they can use to hurt Democrats right now, right? Because again, everything the Democrats have done in these first 100 days have been popular, right? Again, the COVID response has been extremely popular. The infrastructure bill the Democrats are proposing Whether it'll pass in its current form or not, who knows? But it is extremely popular as well, at least most parts of it, right? The public is behind Democrats on issues of gun control, even if Congress probably won't act in that area. And so they're trying to find something. And so this issue of immigration is that something, right? It worked for them in the past. It worked for them at the end of the Obama administration, right? It didn't work so well in 2018, right? When they tried to create this idea again that there was a crisis at the border. But now there is a crisis, right? The media, of course, likes to talk about the crisis because it is a problem. And I think that's sort of the main goal of this, right? Whether to designate them terrorists or not, as you said correctly, right? For the most part, most definitions of terrorism internationally and in the United States essentially require a political component. It is not just that you cause violence as a terrorist group. It is that you cause violence with a political end, right? Con un fin político, with a political goal at the end of your violence. Yeah. The drug cartels, the Mexican drug cartels, don't meet that criteria, right? They have no political goals. They don't really care who's in office. They don't have any ideology. Their purpose is to make money. And so they don't really fit the definitions that we have of terrorism. Having said that, right, many of the provisions, for example, in the USA Patriot Act, what's left of it after it's been changed all these times, actually can be used against organized crime and institutions like drug cartels. The difference in the tools that the United States government has to fight terrorism versus what it has to fight organized crime are really not that different. And so to me, this was a way for Governor Abbott to try to create more of an issue here, try to get back into the news, keep this issue fresh in people's minds, and maybe a way to try to also, rev up his own support, right? His response to the terrible snowstorms that Texas saw a few months ago were not great, right? That was the time when Ted Cruz flew to Cancun, right? And then flew back for that he was supposedly dropping off his daughters in Cancun or something, right? Texas Republican Party took kind of a beating with that. And this is also kind of a way to try to find other things for Texans to focus on that are not how badly he handled these, snowstorms and the damage to the electrical grid in Texas and so on, which was really disastrous for hundreds of thousands, really millions of people in Texas, and everything else that the Republican Party can sort of be blamed for. So the bottom line is, whether you designate cartels as terrorists or not doesn't really change. There are some differences, yes, but it doesn't really substantially change what the U.S. government can do to fight organized crime versus terrorism organizations. And even if you did, what's the Biden administration going to do? Are they going to have drone strikes in Mexico? Probably not, right? I don't think that would do very much for the bilateral relationship. That's also just not what President Biden, I believe, stands for, right? So even if you opened up, for example, the possibility of using drone strikes or using, without Mexico's consent, having small teams of, special forces, right, intervening in Mexico to try to capture or kill some of these cartel members. It's just not going to happen, right? It's simply outside of the purview of possibility. So.
And it doesn't work. They tried the kingpin strategy, killing or arresting the leaders of organizations, and then just someone steps into the place, so that doesn't work.
Exactly, right? Mexico's tried this, and for our viewers in the States, right, this was exactly the strategy that Mexico pursued, just like you said, for about a decade, right, in this drug war that is now slowly, it's now 15 years old. And as you said, it just doesn't work, right? There's always somebody else. There's always the next guy. And yes, they're almost always guys, right? It's always the next guy, and it doesn't really do anything for you, and it would be obviously disastrous for the bilateral relationship.
And it can turn the situation worse, because the vacuum of power just creates a split factions, and then those split factions go at war at each other, and then violence just gets worse. That's not a strategy that's gonna work.
No. So in my view, some of the biggest things that the U.S. could do if you designated them as terrorist organization was those sorts of actions that basically would, are military kinds of actions, which are just not going to happen anyway. They probably would be in violation of the law of war, at least as viewed internationally, because we're not dealing with an armed conflict, at least not Mexico's never accepted that there is an armed conflict in Mexico or multiple armed conflicts in Mexico. Whether there are or there aren't is sort of a question for a different analysis. But if you use the military strikes by the U.S. within Mexican territory, that would definitely be basically an armed conflict. It's not going to happen, right? Let's make that very clear. Whether you designate them as terrorist groups or not, it's just not going to happen. So this, to me, is just a way for Governor Abbott and for Republicans in Texas to make a lot of noise, to try to distract from, basically the beating politically that they've taken in Texas in the last few months, and at a more, sort of national scale, a way to try for Republicans to try to have the American people focus on this one point that has been complicated during Biden's first 100 days, rather than on the successes in relation to COVID and infrastructure and so on.
Yeah, I agree completely with your take on it. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was gonna change the topic so you can finish this one, and then we'll change the topic.
Well, actually, let's change it because we're going over to Biden and Putin, right? And so I'll just leave it in for that section. Let's go.
Okay, perfect. So basically, on this Tuesday, April 13th, they announced that they had a working meeting. They had discussed a bunch of security issues. Basically, the New START Treaty, which regulates the arms that each country do, and it was a product of the end of the Cold War. But then today, Biden announced sanctions against Russia for their meddling in the U.S. elections, among other things against the U.S. So what's your take on it? I know sanctions tend to be like a half measure. Yeah. They're not really doing anything, but it is a political action that has some weight.
Yeah, Biden's sort of in between two things, right? On the one hand, he wants to make sure that it's clear to the American people, to the world, right, that Russia's interference in Western elections, not just American elections, right, in Western elections and in other areas, right, of life are not going to go unpunished, so to speak, right, are not going to go they're not going to go without a response. This was a big criticism, right, that a lot of people, including Republicans in Congress, had of President Trump, that he basically was unwilling to bring these difficult topics up with Vladimir Putin and the government in Russia, and he was not willing to support sanctions or other measures to sort of send a signal, right, that this was not going to be acceptable. So Biden, on the one hand, has to do this. He has to pass sanctions. He has to try to show that the U.S. is doing something, right? They expelled a number of Russian diplomats. This is something that used to happen a lot during the Cold War, right? These people who were supposed to be diplomats, they weren't really diplomats. They really worked for the KGB, right, back then. The U.S. does the same thing, right? They're diplomats in Russia and elsewhere that are really working for the CIA or other agencies. This is well known. This is not a secret or anything of the sort, right? And so these sorts of responses, they might not do a lot in practice, but they're necessary to send a message, hey, we're not just going to accept this. So Biden has to do that. On the other hand, and I think Biden actually believes that there is a real value in doing this. It's not just theater. There is a value in showing the U.S. is not just going to sit back and let Russia interfere in elections. On the other side is the New START Treaty, right? This is sort of the most recent product of the nuclear arms limitations treaties that started to be put into place after, right, or towards the end of the Cold War, even during the Cold War, still at the very end, right? And that have slowly reduced the nuclear arsenals of both the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia, right, over the last 35 years or so. The last treaty that the U.S. and Russia agreed to was back in the Obama administration. It was actually ratified by the Senate. They got a number of Republican votes. I think it was 12 or 14 Republican votes in the Senate, right, at the time, and it was ratified, right? You need 2/3 of the senators to vote yes. That's 67 senators. It got 67 senators. It got quite a few Republicans. Most of those Republicans are no longer in the Senate. And so any new treaty will probably have it will be a little more complicated to get ratified. However, they're necessary, right? It's extremely important to continue to limit and try to continue to reduce the nuclear weapons arsenals of the US and Russia, right? Yes, the UK and France and China and India and Pakistan and Israel and North Korea have nuclear weapons, but the number of weapons that they have and the capabilities they have to deliver them are much more limited than the US's and Russia's. And so that's why the focus has been on the two. That's why I think there are very serious voices in both countries, right, in Russia too, that are calling for to make sure that this New START treaty does happen, right? That we're able to come to an agreement with Russia on this. It's also important because both countries have withdrawn over the last 20 years. Both countries have slowly withdrawn from other treaties that limited other types of nuclear weapons, specifically what we call intermediate range nuclear weapons that can be used on battlefields, or for example, an agreement in the early 2000s that President Bush withdrew from, which was basically a tactical nuclear weapons treaty, where these are nuclear weapons that are supposed to be quote unquote small, right, and that they can be used directly on a battlefield against soldiers, not to take out, a certain installation, but actually on a battlefield, right? And so as the U.S. and Russia have slowly withdrawn from these other treaties, limiting and reducing reducing the number of weapons and limiting the capabilities through which you can deliver those nuclear weapons on a large scale, right? Most of these intercontinental ballistic missiles and so on, I think has become even more important. So Biden, I believe, does have a strong personal interest and a strong policy interest in making sure that the relationship with Russia is good enough to get this treaty through. But also, Russia has an incentive for this as well, right? Putin's brand is nationalism. The reason that he continues to be popular in Russia is because he sells this vision of Russian nationalism, right? But at the same time, the economic reality for Russia is not one where they can maintain and continue to solvent all of these, this massive nuclear arsenal. So the reality is they have to disarm, and it's better, or at least, to disarm to some degree, and it's better to do it through this process with the U.S. than to do it unilaterally and allow the U.S. to continue to have, or rather for the U.S. to have a larger arsenal than Russia.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that will be one of the main topics when they do meet. President Biden has announced his willingness to meet with Putin. Putin has said that he also would like to meet, but that he will look over the conditions that Biden puts for it, while he has said that he might not put any conditions. One thing that I found really interesting is that that meeting might not happen neither in Russia or in the US. There's been these countries such as Finland that have said that they are open to hosting this meeting, which would be really interesting because that would be kind of similar as to when Trump met with Kim Jong-un and didn't meet in North Korea or the US, but they met at a neutral point, to say so. So I think, just to close, what do you believe that Biden's and Putin's relationship will be, and how will it compare to Trump's and Putin's relationship?
Yeah, by the way, about where they meet, right? That was also common during the Cold War. Some of those, a lot of negotiations over the first arms limitations treaties were not in the Soviet Union or in the U.S. They were in some of them were in Stockholm, some of them were in Finland. So there's a history of this happening. The relationship is going to be, I think, one of more respect. I don't think Vladimir Putin had very much respect for Donald Trump, and that was probably merited. And Donald Trump was never, for whatever reason, we don't really know, right, was never willing or able to be firm with Vladimir Putin on issues that mattered to the United States. And right, I mean, at one point he said that he would take Vladimir Putin's word about what happened with the U.S. elections over what he was hearing from U.S. intelligence leaders, right? I mean, that sort of statement, I think, is one that probably made a lot of people in Russia a lot of people in the Russian government, right, very gleeful, right, to hear an American president saying, we're going to trust Russian officials over our own intelligence, right? So that's not going to happen with President Biden. And so I think the relationship is going to be one that's more based on mutual respect, not because they were calling each other names in the country, right, but because I think there's going to be one where both sides are sort of playing the roles that they should be playing based on the way the relationship is right now. So is it going to be worse than Trump and Putin's? Well, it's going to be less friendly, that's for sure, right? But it actually might lead to more things getting done. because if both of them can actually say, hey, we're not going to back down from some of these core ideas and core issues that we care about and that are important to us, that might actually lead to there being more space to come to some agreement on the really important issues like reducing nuclear weapons. And so, I mean, it's easy to forget, right? For those of us who grew up after the Cold War, I mean, I was born the year the Berlin Wall came down, right? For those of us who grew up after the Cold War, it's easy to forget that there are still these two gigantic nuclear arsenals out there that could destroy the planet many, many times over, right? And that we have come in the last 70 years, the world has come very close on numerous occasions to that sort of nuclear apocalypse, either because of real crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, in the 1960s, or by mistake, right? We now know that in both countries, there have oftentimes been mistakes where it looks like the other country is attacking and they're really not, right? And if the Soviet Union or the United States had mistakenly responded to that, right, we would have had World War III and a nuclear disaster. And so the fact that Putin now knows that he's dealing with a stronger, more serious character in the White House, I think is actually a positive, and that it's going to allow the countries to really say, okay, I get it, right? I'm going to keep trying to interfere in your elections. I'm Russia, right? I'm going to keep trying to interfere in your elections, and you as the US are going to try to keep putting sanctions on me and stopping me. Okay, fine. Let's try to focus then on these issues where we actually can find some common ground, which I very much hope will be continued arms reduction treaties.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with that closing statement, we can close. We'll see you next Monday at 4 p.m. here on the Lab for Quaestionare English version. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Valeria.